You're listening to an ECGI podcast on corporate power and the politics of change with Matteo Gatti.
For most of the past decade, American corporations have been speaking on racial justice, on climate change, on bathroom bills, on voting rights, guns, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And most of their speech has leaned in one direction, democratic. Here's the puzzle, though. The CEOs doing most of that talking are, by a wide margin, Republican donors. And new research shows that corporate activism has been detrimental to shareholder value. The law largely gets out of the way. Corporations have broad speech rights, and boards face almost no judicial scrutiny for the positions they take. But that just opens the real question. Does any of these actually work, and for whom? Today, I have two guests who have been asking exactly that. One finds that CEO activism is strategic. It responds to market segmentation in a polarized consumer landscape. The other finds that partisan corporate speech has, on average, led to negative returns for investors. Same phenomenon, different lens, and together, a considerably more complex picture. I am Matteo Gatti. This is Corporate Power and the Politics of Change, an ECGI podcast. Stay with us. Welcome to Corporate Power and the Politics of Change, an ECGI podcast. I'm Matteo Gatti, Professor of Law at Rutgers Law School, a research member of the European Corporate Governance Institute, and the author of Corporate Power and the Politics of Change, published by Cambridge University Press. My book is about what I call corporate governing, the phenomenon by which corporations have stepped into contested socioeconomic spaces, taking positions and making choices that once belonged to governments. Today's conversation goes straight to the empirical heart of that phenomenon. Let me set up the legal baseline quickly. First, my guests are economists and I want to be empathetic. Second, the law is not where the interesting questions live. Corporate speech is constitutionally protected. The business judgment rule gives board extraordinarily wide latitude. Under virtually any theory of corporate purpose, simply articulating a plausible long-term business rationale is enough to insulate a board from liability. What is not settled is whether any of these actually work for shareholders, for stakeholders, for society. That is precisely what today's guests have been asking. Swarnodeep Homroy is Associate Professor at the University of Groningen and University of Southampton. His paper with Subhasis Gangopadhyay, Strategic CEO Activism in Polarized Markets, published in the Journal of Financial and Quantitative Analysis, is a seminal empirical study of CEO activism, and work I rely on extensively in my book. He's joined today by Elisabeth Kempf, Associate Professor of Finance at Harvard Business School. Elisabeth's research spans political economy, corporate governance, and finance. Today, we discuss her paper with Will Cassidy, Partisan Corporate Speech, her work with Slava Foss and Margarita Zuzzura on the political polarization of America's corporate executive teams, and her most recent paper, Corporate Actions as Moral Issues, with Zetelina Ilieva and Oliver Spalt. Swarnodeep, Elisabeth, welcome. It's really great to have you both here.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation.
Okay, Swarnodeep, let me start with the central puzzle your paper addresses. Most S&P 500 CEOs are Republican donors, yet when they speak out on social issues, what they say is almost exclusively Democratic leaning. What is going on?
So think about what the CEOs are trying to do. The CEOs are trying to do business in a country that's extraordinarily divided in recent times. As Elisabeth shows in her papers, that there are a lot of economic agents that are extremely politically polarized. And not only are they politically polarized, they're also geographically separated. Democrat voters live in urban centers, Republican voters live downtown and out of the urban centers. So when there is a social incident. So, for example, the Black Lives Matter movement that happened after George Floyd was murdered in Minneapolis or killed, whichever version you believe in. The CEOs have a choice to make. And when they make a choice, when they make a statement on these socially and politically divisive issues, their Democrat-leaning customers in the urban centers are watching. Their Republican-leaning customers in the suburbs are also watching. Now, what we show is that the Democrat-leaning customers react quite a lot to these CEO speeches on social issues. And that persists for even after 8 weeks of the incident and the speech. The Republican-leaning customers, on the other hand, they do react minorly, but it's temporary and transient. In about 3-4 weeks, they return to their baseline consumption patterns. And therefore, for a CEO, it is a strategic opportunity to gain customers, to build brand loyalty among a set that's already sensitized to the topic. And that's what we document in this paper. If this was purely done by corporation and the CEO's political consumption of itself, then we would expect their political views to align very closely with what their donation patterns are. So let's take, for example, Tim Cook. He speaks a lot on LGBT issues. That's because he represents that community. So that would be seen as something that the CEO is speaking on issues that are personally close to them. However, that might as well be true in certain cases, but systematically, we show that this effect is primarily driven by the strategic opportunity because of the asymmetric patterns of consumption between Democrat and Republican consumers.
Thank you. Were you able to also find something about consequences on the capital markets? Your data suggests anything on that front?
So capital markets are prediction engines, right? So whenever a CEO makes these statements, the investors are trying to update their priors as to how this would affect the corporation going forward. And we see that indeed the investors value these firms. There's a minor 0.12% increase in values when the CEOs make these statements. This sounds small, but for a large cap companies, which most of these CEOs represent, that's a significant magnitude. However, there's of course a heterogeneous effect. There are some companies that gain more, and these are companies that operate more in politically polarized environment, i.e., their business is spread across regions where there's political polarization.
Okay, so we will come back to investor reaction in a second with Elisabeth, but I just want to point out that you also looked in a different paper, arguably in a harder context. Those were the corporate responses to the January 6th Capitol riots. Back then, some firms announced pauses in their political donations. So does the strategic logic hold even there, where the political stakes are considerably higher?
I think the strategic logic is particularly accentuated there. That's a more difficult paper to write because it's one incident at a time when there are several other things going on. But I think the strategic logic is even more prominent there. So what we show is companies that are more exposed to political risks. They are the ones that quietly renege on the promise of never donating to Republicans again within the first 3 months of making that commitment. The commitment themselves came at a time when the value of political donation was at the lowest in terms of where in the electoral cycle we were. It was just after the presidential election, and therefore donations were never going to be made quite heavily in the next 3 months.
Right. So your picture is one of strategic rationality, right? So Republican donor CEOs, even they speak Democrat language, not out of convention, but because they're reading their consumer base. But then something else has been happening simultaneously, and in some ways it complicates the picture because the executive pool itself has been shifting. And Elisabeth, you and your co-authors have documented that. You use voter registration data for top executives at S&P 1,500 firms over more than a decade. And just tell us what you found. What is actually happening to the partisan composition of American executive teams?
Yeah, we see two important trends there. The first one is that the executive pool as a whole has become more democratic. It's still predominantly Republican. So on average, we see 70% Republican versus 30% Democratic executives among the top 5 earners of large publicly US companies. So this is the sample that we're looking at. But after 2016, the Democratic share has risen noticeably by almost 5 percentage points. And so at a first glance, if you care about viewpoint diversity, that sounds like good news, right? The executive pool as a whole has become more politically diverse. But the second finding is the surprising one. It's although the executive pool as a whole has become more diverse, the average executive team did not. And the share of what we call perfectly homogeneous teams, which are teams where all partisan executives have the same party affiliation, if anything, actually slightly increased over our sample period, which, by the way, is 2008 to 2022. And the average homogeneity kind of barely moved. So the question is, how can these two things be true? And the answer is political sorting has increased. So we see more Democrats working with Democrats, Republicans with Republicans. And we find that political alignment has become a more important determinant of both entry and exit into executive teams. So that means that executives are increasingly entering teams that look more like them politically, and they're increasingly leaving teams where they are more politically different. And so that means firms have become more politically sorted, and that is really the key result, that political alignment within the top executive team has become a more important driver of executive turnover and team composition.
That creates an incredibly interesting puzzle, right? Because investors might actually like that if you have a team that is more cohesive. And I think that somebody in the literature is also suggested that. How do you see
so
this?
you're right. Ex ante, it's actually not clear, is this in the interest or not of shareholders? Would they like this or not? On the one hand, you could argue, well, maybe homogeneity is good if, partisans increasingly disagree and there's a huge amount of friction when you throw Democrats and Republicans together, then maybe having more homogeneous teams is better. The counter argument would be, well, you might be, losing valuable executive talent because of these partisan frictions, or maybe you're losing viewpoint diversity. Our paper is not going to, come in super strongly on that question. We do have evidence from stock price reactions to announcements of executive departures that suggest that losing misaligned executives, is detrimental to the stock price. So losing them is not in the interest of shareholders. But I think we need much more work precisely on this question of like what is the effect of changing team homogeneity, both on corporate policies, kind of how the firm behaves, but then of course also questions of efficiency.
Okay, so the work by Swarnodeep suggests that democratic lean in corporate speech is strategic. Republican donor CEOs cater to their stakeholders, broader stakeholders. Elisabeth's work with her co-author show that the executive pool has shifted left since 2016. And in fact, Riley Steele, another guest on this podcast, has documented that while CEOs remain the most conservative members of the C-suite, senior managers actually skew liberal by 2022, which is consistent with what you were seeing. The big question is whether democratic leaning corporate speech is a strategic adaptation, is ideological drift among the people making decisions, or both. And, there's another paper by Elisabeth with Will Cassidy, which is called Partisan Corporate Speech, which comes in handy. What Elisabeth and Will document in the paper is the tension between strategy and ideology. And the findings make the pictures more complicated. I don't want to steal it from you, Elisabeth. Do you want to tell us what you have found there?
Yeah, so what we do in that paper, we develop a measure of what we call partisan corporate speech. And the idea is essentially we look at all statements that S&P 500 companies put out on the social media platform Twitter, now X. And we label statements as highly partisan sounding if they kind of have a very high similarity with speech by politicians. So we kind of let the data tell us what is, partisan speech. It's essentially statements that sound very similar to statements by either Democratic or Republican politicians. Now, with that measure, we document three main facts. The first one is that corporate speech on Twitter became much more partisan over our time period. We're looking at 2012 to 2022 here. And before 2017, highly partisan corporate speech was actually very rare. So you find only about, half of 1% of all tweets that companies put out there had a strong partisan slant. But then over the second part of our time period, that partisan speech exploded. And we see in some months it reached levels that were 10 times as high as what we saw in the pre-17 period. So that's finding number one. The second finding is that this increase in partisan speech is overwhelmingly driven by more democratic sounding speech. And so that is consistent with also the patterns that Swarnodeep sees in his data on and CEO activism. And what surprised us was how broad-based this shift was. It wasn't only consumer-facing firms or Democratic-led firms or firms with Democratic workforces. We see it across essentially all sectors, across all states, across CEO political affiliations, and across firms with very different employee bases. And the third style aspect that we document is that these partisan statements are followed on average by negative abnormal stock returns of approximately 20 basis points. And that really created the big puzzle for us and the puzzle of the paper. On the one hand, we see firms increasingly sending those partisan signals, but on the other hand, we see that the stock market reaction is negative. The question is, why would value maximizing firms keep doing something that the stock market appears to dislike?
And you seem to suggest that it's not necessarily the ideology, because we know that the ideology doesn't tell us much based on what we just learned. And it is actually trying to guess investor preferences. Can you tell us more?
Yeah, so exactly. The investor side is kind of the central mechanism in our paper. And we do not think that the main explanation is that, managers suddenly became more, ideological or more democratic leaning and started to engage more in this. In that sense, we're very much aligned with, Swarnodeep's views of this phenomenon. In our model, firms are also strategic and firm managers are strategic. But what's different is that here in our setting, the polarized environment doesn't create an opportunity for firms that they kind of freely can tap into, but instead it acts more as a constraint. So let me explain that a little better, and let me actually take a step back on why we thought about thinking about the investor side in the first place. So the first thing that we notice is that just when you look at the time series, this democratic sounding speech tracks very closely the growth in assets under management of sustainable funds. So this just jumps out in the time series, just how closely these two are related, and that the increase in democratic sounding corporate speech kind of, lagged the growth in sustainable assets under management by a year or so. And the other thing that we thought the investor side could be a promising, mechanism is that it would explain why this shift was so broad-based, why we see it kind of across, firms in all industries, consumer-facing, non-consumer-facing, and democratic and less democratic-leaning workforces. But in some sense, it makes this puzzle even bigger, right? If it looks like investors were pushing firms in this direction, then why are the stock returns negative? And so this is where our model comes in. In our model, investors are not all the same. There's some investors that like the speech and others that do not like it. And what's different from the product market, that's one of Swarnodeep studies where firms might be, very selectively targeting, an aligned consumer base. But when you're looking at public equity markets, it's very hard, especially for large firms, to raise capital only from an aligned investor base. And so because the shares trade in a broad market, the stock price has to clear the market across investors with very different political preferences. And so essentially what has to happen if you're upsetting one part of the investor base, but you still need to raise capital from them, the price has to adjust such that these investors are still willing to hold the stock. And so this is the first important ingredient of the model, that you kind of have to raise capital from both of these groups. The second important ingredient of the model is that once investors expect you to take a position, silence is no longer neutral, or silence becomes costly. And so that means that, if many firms are speaking out on a controversial bill or a social movement or a political event, if you are one of the few who remain silent, you're effectively also sending a political signal, whether you want to or not. And so effectively, the firm faces a very difficult choice. You can speak out or you can stay silent, but staying silent is basically the same as also sending a political signal. And so you are going to alienate somebody, and the firm kind of strategically chooses the less costly option. And so again, I think the key difference is that in our model, polarization acts more as a constraint on the firm's choice set, rather than purely as an opportunity that firms, are free to exploit. And so this is how we reconcile these two facts, that on the one hand, we see more partisan speech, possibly in response to changing investor preferences. But once you're in these political controversies, effectively, you're going to end up alienating one important group. And so this is what the negative stock price reaction.
Right. And the important reminder for our listeners is that the time series stop in 2022. I'm not sure if you're going to continue it, but it would be interesting because I suspect that corporate partisan speech has declined, especially during the second Trump administrations, because executives are scared. And all the while, there was a crackdown on ESG, and especially the big three or big four have gone quiet on these things, and so those dynamics that you were observing back then have changed. So, just curious if you are extending the
I
scope.
would love to. So actually, our access to Twitter kind of, ended in early 2023. Back then, Twitter was very generous with access to their data for academics. And so this is kind of where our data end. We do see already, especially in early 23, a decline in the amount of partisan corporate speech. And I would expect, if I could extend the data further, that would have continued. What I think has changed is not so much like the fundamentals. I think there's still stakeholders care about things other than pure profit maximization. There's still a desire for firms to take a stance, but I think the costs have kind of gone up a lot. That both sides are much more organized. When they're targeting firms, we've also seen that how costly it can be when state governments or federal government retaliates against firms that take strong partisan positions. So I think the cost benefit kind of has changed. And so what I would expect is that going forward, or in the current time, that we see much less partisan corporate speech, that firms are maybe more selective in this. And in fact, what I hear is that many companies have tried to adopt more systematic approaches or procedures that they adopt that helps them navigate kind of when do we take a position or not. And so be more systematic about that than, in the initial phase, which is kind of the focus of our sample period.
So this is extremely interesting because you point out something that, and this is shameless cross promotion, if you will. There's another episode of these podcasts with Jill Fish and Tim Smith, and Jill has a paper out with Jeff Schwartz about corporate values versus value. One of the insight of the paper is that it's kind of easy-ish to guess what consumers want and what your employees want. I mean, the employees' workforce is there. So guessing what investors want is very hard, if only because some of, the biggest ones are intermediated, so you don't know who actually is your ultimate beneficial investor there. And in their paper, they also point out that we're at a time where, this administration is trying to do all they can to sort of thwart shareholder voice. And so they were mentioning that, the devices we now have, which is shareholder proposals, is a low cost way to sort of like try to guess at least what they want at the specific company level. But this is also going to be gone. So there's going to be much more guessing going forward.
Yeah, exactly. I think you're raising an important point, which is that if firms want to be serious about, maximizing shareholder welfare, or like taking into account, things other than profit maximization, how do they even have this right systems in place to, understand what these preferences look like, and, especially in aggregate? And I would agree with this view that, probably firms have very good tools, especially on the consumer research front, where, right, there's a whole industry, lots of research being done on understanding what specific consumer segments want. But I think there's much less systems in place or corporate toolkits in place to kind of systematically assess, probably also what do employees want. I think there's maybe a risk that you're always going to hear the loudest voices, perhaps, but it's difficult to get like a systematic view of the entire workforce. And the same for shareholder preference as well. It's a measurement problem for sure.
Right. And speaking about loudest voices, it might also be that investors, especially since you're tracking abnormal returns in the T10 and T30 window, they might just not like that the corporation got in trouble with some politicians because there was, a PR disaster, right? And sometimes that's what the reaction might be vis-a-vis. Think about a firm that does all its quote unquote pro-social work through commitments, through policies, etc. That stuff sort of goes under the radar for a while. I mean, it's publicized to some extent, but not as much as somebody, a senior manager picking up Twitter or X and telling what their political positions are.
Swarnodeep already nicely pointed this out, that we should be very realistic about like what these event studies, can and cannot accomplish. I think they're very useful in giving you a sense of like how investors updated, at the time where the speech occurs. They may or may not have, fully anticipated, the long run consequences of partisan corporate speech. I think there's like two reasons why I think they probably weren't massively underestimating the long run benefits. One is that we've tried to look at, are there big reversals in stock in the stock returns over, 4, 6, 9, 12 months. Now, of course, the caveat is that, as everyone who works with stock return data over longer periods of time, they get incredibly noisy. So it's hard to say anything with statistical precision. But at least we don't find like, any evidence of a strong reversal there over longer periods of time. And the other reason is that, when I talk to practitioners, I don't get the impression that they felt that this was a big, easy success story engaging in, partisan debates, and that if anything, there were many kind of negative consequences that they themselves hadn't anticipated ex ante. So this is purely anecdotal, but just from kind of talking to practitioners, I don't get the impression that there was like this, longer term benefit that we just didn't see in the initial stock price reaction.
And Swarnodeep before mentioned heterogeneity that he sort of found in his own data, and it might also do some work here. In other words, there may be some firms that make a big mistake. Maybe you could think about Disney when it got in the fight with Ron DeSantis. And then there are some others who know what they're doing. They've been doing that for quite a while. And so it's just a skill that some have. And so when you look at the average, sure, you see negative, but there are some good firms at this game, so to speak. And, the question is, what are we going to do about it? Whether there is any policy takeaway here, or we just have to wait and see, have more data and let them play this, and then let them, get burned. And then, there's going to be an equilibrium where they decide to be a little quieter, which is probably what we're seeing here.
Yeah. So, I mean, first of all, like I think empirical phenomenon, you'd see that the average mass, there is substantial heterogeneity underneath it. We see that too, for example, in our data, also the statements that tend to be better aligned with the employee base and with the investor base tend to have less negative reactions. It's kind of hard to make it really strongly positive, but at least you see like much less negative reactions in those cases. There's also heterogeneity across topics, across time, and I would be very cautious to say to take away from this, we have to kind of regulate firm speech or what they're allowed to talk about. By the way, our model is also silent on whether this is good from a welfare perspective, right? It could very well be that kind of these non-pecuniary utility that investors get from being aligned, is bigger than the stock price decline that we see once you aggregate. So there's the welfare question, but then there's also, I think, the question that this was a very new phenomenon, and as you point out, like it may not have been realistic to expect companies to excel on this, right away when, you don't have these tools to like really systematically understand, what do shareholders want, what do employees want, just because this is not something that companies have had decades developing.
That's right. So you mentioned pecuniary benefits for investors, and I want to go back to that in a second. But before, I want to sort of bring back Swarnodeep to sort of try to find a reconciliation between the two lines of work. So in a way, under both of your works, the CEOs are strategic. It's just that they're strategic towards a different constituency. I mean, at least that you found that, that was your study design. Swarnodeep and Elisabeth and Will sort of conclude that they were doing that because of investor preferences. Now, it is the consumers. In your paper, when you looked at the data, that strategy actually seemed to work. They were able to create value in polarized product markets. And Cassidy and Kempf, institutional investors with ESG mandates, and maybe unclear, but maybe the strategy destroys some value on average. Is there a way to reconcile? And who do you think is the constituency that is louder and that is more important at this stage?
I think in both our papers, the forces are similar, right? So there's a force towards, let's say, liberal left leaning, and there's a counter force trying to go back to a more conservative setup. For consumers, what we show is that the liberal force dominates the Republican views, at least up until that. And I think the time period is very important. Both of our papers are pretty much around the time the second Trump administration was taking office. So it's a very different world now. But in any case, I think in our paper, we show that when we focus on the constituency that the consumers are, the Democrat voice lasts longer and are stronger than the Republican voices. Elizabeth's paper, the forces are very similar. It's that the relative effects are different. And that can be, at a given point in time, both can be true.
And I cannot help but again bring back the time series or an extension time series, because now we actually are seeing corporations that are vocally pro this administration, right? You look at Palantir, lots of AI firms, tech firms, Meta did a very famous pivot here, right? They used to be all pro diversity, and then all of a sudden, right before the inauguration for Trump 2.0, gave that interview where he said that no, they were dismantling all DEI policies. So I wonder if the times are right for a new set of studies that are looking at what is happening now under the second administration.
So I think when we do research, what we are trying to do, anybody who's doing research, you, me, Elisabeth, we are trying to look into the black box that the companies are, and we are interpreting signals that are coming out of it and trying to make sense of that and then making predictions. And we hope, as researchers, that one day our predictions will be proven right. So in our CEO Activism paper, we end the paper saying that we see these social voices because of these asymmetric reactions between the Democrat and the Republican constituencies. And we wonder, if they were to become symmetric, would the social voice of the company persist? And lo and behold, in the second Trump administration, we see all the tech bros in his inauguration, right? So I think there would be another generation of papers, but the more fundamental point that I think both Elisabeth and I are interested in is the extent to which polarization is affecting this economic decision making that wasn't to this extent. So Elisabeth has a paper, and again, shameless counter promotion. Elisabeth has a paper that shows that it affects supply chain decisions when they're sourcing from overseas. You have seen my paper, Matteo, where we look at, I'm Elisabeth too, where we look at domestic supply chains, and it seems that what Elisabeth see at the board level, that seems to play out in corporations making choices when they choose their suppliers. So Nandini Gupta and I, we show that the Democrat and Republican companies choose suppliers disproportionately now who are more similar in partisan stripe than ever before.
Yeah, and to be fair with you, your actual prediction in your first paper, the one we started with, explains what's been happening with Palantir, where the CEO used to be a Democratic donor, and then it turns out the U.S. government, it's their biggest customer, so why not making Donald Trump happy with lots of
Exactly.
pro-war type speech to keep those contracts going. So, Elisabeth, I want to go back for a second to your recent paper about the values, right? About corporate values. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Do you mean the corporate actions as moral issues?
Correct. Yes.
Paper. Yeah. So in that paper, we were trying to understand, kind of surveying a representative sample of Americans. How do they view, company decisions, and how do they think companies should trade off profit maximization against social concerns? And so what we found there is actually, interestingly, that if you look at the relative rank on those issues, the issues that were, most salient, I would argue, in the ESG and corporate speech debate, DEI and climate, are actually among the most polarizing. So where you see the largest partisan gaps. But at the same time, there's other issues where we found actually surprising, bipartisan alignment. So, for example, both Republicans and Democrats think that firms should care about treatment of workers and curb high CEO pay. So it's actually surprising, or when you kind of overlay that with the kind of topics that we see companies speak about, that for some reason they chose to speak out on the most polarizing issues. So I think this is one of the important findings that we have there. I think in your book, you actually kind of provide a nice explanation for, why that might be happening, because you argue that part of the reason why there's increased pressure on firms to, engage on social issues is that people are unhappy with government, or because it's dysfunctional. And so we see a lot of the big rise, both in, assets under management in sustainable funds, and also in the democratic sounding speech during the first Trump administration, where arguably Democrats were frustrated or unhappy with how much progress was made on these issues like diversity and climate. And so it's actually kind of, I think, from that, seen through that lens, not so surprising that these are kind of the issues where they were exerting a lot of pressure on corporations. So I thought like the way you lay it out in your book kind of provides a nice intuition for why it might have happened that, there was the most pressure on the most polarizing issues.
Appreciate a lot your words. Now, so one of the things that one might note after reading your paper is that, in fact, the people that all Americans care more about are things that are more economic in nature, that in some ways an old left-winger would care about. But those are probably more difficult to pass at the corporate level, because guess what? CEOs like their pay, and CEOs like to fire people because shareholder value goes up when that happens. And all the while, it turns out there's separate research that came out after I closed my paper that I'm sure you're aware of. I think it's a person from Harvard, a person from the MIT, who show that programming on cable news about quote unquote cultural issues sells more, yields way more ratings than talking about the economy, because the economy is sort of boring for people. But when they think about who should compete in the NCAA, and if you have trans athletes, that everybody's going to have an opinion, and that's going to junk up ratings. And so you sort of like see this in your survey in some way reflect.
Yeah. You mean that the fact that these issues are the most polarizing and those ended up, yeah.
So, and there's an entire industry there that likes to sort of like keep the flame, right? Because they sell a lot of copies, are like old man's jargon, but they sell ratings and views and engagement. And so
absolutely, yeah. And so the asset management industry might have found it precisely particularly profitable to cater to investors precisely on these issues. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so I want to close. I mean, before you sort of both urge to be cautious and to wait and to do more studies, but I'm a lawyer, and I'm a policy happy trigger. So I want to see whether we have any policy prescriptions of any sort, or this is something that we should leave corporations to sort of find out. Swarnodeep, do you think that any type of fix, any type of intervention is warranted, or we just leave it to the market for now?
So if it is about corporate speech, I think the market has already shown that the market disciplines corporate speech, right? But if it's about the corporate reaction to polarization, I think that's a bigger question. And there, I think there are potential interventions being required. We need to think a bit more seriously as social scientists and as legal scholars, is the extent to which this polarization wave that we are seeing is a cyclical phenomena, or is it structural, right? And whether or not we think about an intervention, it really depends on how we think in that question. We have seen polarization happen before, but that was pre-social media, pre-artificial intelligence, and therefore it was a very different kind of a beast than what we are facing now. So if this is structural, then one might want to think about what Elisabeth was mentioning, the welfare implications of this. We need a lot more understanding about the welfare implications before we regulate or make policies.
Elisabeth, anything to add, or you just...
Yeah, I fully agree with that. And I do think there's also an opportunity to do more research precisely on this feedback loop between what companies do and how this, further feeds into polarization of society. I think companies are fascinating because they are actually, one of the places where people are the most likely to encounter, people with a different view. So if you kind of see more segregation also in the workplace, it's worrisome from that perspective. Also, what it does when we start to increasingly kind of consume different goods, and I can tell immediately based on the sneakers that you wear or what you eat, what your partisan leaning is. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to understand also that part better, like what are the social costs of companies exploiting strategically perhaps these that polarized society.
Okay, so we're heading to a close, and I want to ask you a last question. In fact, I'm going to throw you a little bit of a curveball because I said I'm a lawyer, so I use my old hat as an advisor. You're very famous authors in the field, and you may have some board who reaches out and asks, okay, so we're expecting that the launch of this product, or us being in this industry, will take us to a heated political territory. What are some suggestions that you would give this board? Of course, everything is factual, so you can say, well, that's too generic, but anything that is generic enough that can fly there?
Yeah, I mean, so first of all, I think firms should be very conscious about why it is that they want to enter a debate. Is it really because they think this is going to increase the demand for the product, or is it going to make employees more loyal, or just kind of being clear about what the intended goal is, or is it because they think it's the right thing to do, right?
Right, of course.
And the other thing is something that we touched upon earlier in the conversation is, I think, just being developing better toolkits to kind of make sure that you're not just listening the loudest, hearing the loudest voices, but kind of get a good sense of how your different stakeholder groups are thinking about it.
Swarnodeep?
So when I think about this, I think when we wrote the CEO Activism paper and what happened afterwards, it seems that this opportunistic window of making a profit, and then maybe that doesn't last, but at least for that time period, making a profit, I think that window is shrinking. So what Elisabeth was saying, that there needs to be a lot more deliberation on this objective. I think customers have become more symmetric in their responses. Employees have, it's not that they were done before, but they've wisened up to these tactics, and regulators have come down hard recently. So I think therefore we might see that speech per se might become more subdued and more homogeneous. And there are now lots of papers, much of this is written by AI anyway. So that might become more subdued and homogeneous. But there would be other effects where the corporations will want to impose its social values, would want to demonstrate its social values. It might not be through direct speech to consumers, but there would be other avenues.
Well, Swarnodeep, Elisabeth, thank you so much. This was a very interesting conversation. And as you know, I am a big fan of your scholarship. And so having you here makes me very happy. And I'm sure our listeners will enjoy it. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Matteo.
Thanks so much.
It was very nice.
Okay, so the papers we discussed today are linked in the show notes. My book, Corporate Power and the Politics of Change, is published by Cambridge University Press. All other episodes in this series are available on the ECGI website and wherever you listen to podcasts, including YouTube. Thank you so much for listening.